Good morning to everybody. Bon dia. Welcome, and thanks to everybody for joining us. The dialogue is delighted to continue its partnership with the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and its Latin American program on a series of public events on Brazil, where important changes are underway under the new administration of Jair Bolsonaro. We have joined forces and worked closely together on several sessions, one before last year's election, one after the election, and most recently on Brazil's emerging foreign policy agenda. We thought it would be useful to once again focus on Brazil to coincide with next week's visit of President Bolsonaro to Washington, D.C. and New York, and his meeting with President Trump next Tuesday at the White House. We're fortunate today to have with us two of Brazil's most thoughtful, sophisticated, and well-informed analysts on economics, politics, and foreign affairs. Both are close personal friends and also close friends of the dialogue. And both are in considerable demand by the media, who often seek their always acute insights. Monica de Boye is a Brazilian macroeconomist who now directs and leads the Latin American Studies program at SAIS. She is also a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Monica regularly contributes to policy discussions and debates on Brazil and frequently writes for major Brazilian newspapers such as Estadão and also Época. Many thanks for being here, Monica, and for your collaboration with the dialogue. Today's event is not only well-timed because of President Bolsonaro's impending visit, but also because Matthias Spector is visiting Washington for a few days, and he has very graciously agreed to join us and share his perspective, not only tied to the president's visit and U.S.-Brazilian relations, but also what is happening in Brazil and where things seem to be headed there. Matthias is an associate professor on international relations and founding director of the Center for International Relations at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo. He writes a weekly column for Folha de São Paulo and has written many books, including one on the relationship between Lula and George W. Bush. We might wonder if he's thinking about another book about the current U.S. and Brazilian presidents. Welcome, Matthias, and thank you so much for joining us. Moderating today's discussion is Peter Hakem, who needs no introduction, and so I won't give him one. He's our in-house guru on Brazil and star kibitzer on Brazil and any number of other issues. Peter speaks and writes frequently on Brazil and U.S.-Brazilian relations. His commentaries have appeared in many prestigious publications, including the Dialogue's Latin American Advisor, which I highly commend to all of you. I look forward to a terrific discussion, and thank you again for joining us this morning. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's a wonderful introduction. And let me just say how enthused we are to have Matthias and Monica with us today, and the timing, as Michael suggested, is perfect with Brazil's new president, Jair Bolsonaro, due to arrive next Monday, less than a week. You made a mistake, Michael. I think he's going to meet with President Trump on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. But, just if anyone has that taken down as a note, that just wanted to keep it. Let me say that the visit here could be a very important one. The two presidents, Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, have something of a natural affinity for one another, it seems. Their early statements have been very positive about building a new relationship between them. President Trump called Bolsonaro very quickly after the inauguration to congratulate him and all. And, There's no question that Brazil, in many respects, is also very enthusiastic about developing a new and better relationship with the United States. And there are good reasons for wanting that. But, you know, this is still a very early stage in the Bolsonaro government. He's been officially inaugurated 2.5 months ago only, and some 3 weeks of that he was hospitalized with the final part of his injuries from a knife wound during the campaign. And, you know, another week was taken up by Carnival in Brazil. So he's really been in office a very short time, and it's obviously early to draw any very strong conclusions about where his administration is heading. But we're going to try to sort of set some base. There is some things he's done. He has a cabinet that he's appointed. He has advisors that are writing down plans and agendas and programs and making some early talks. And the big question here is, we're going to ask Monica and Mateos, is, you know, what should we be expecting from a Bolsonaro government? Does he have a good set of advisors to deal with the very difficult problems Brazil is facing, from the economy to corruption to crime and violence in the streets? What about his ideological agenda? What should we expect from that? And finally, of course, what should we be expecting from his meeting with Trump and the U.S. Brazil relations? Why don't we let Monica start off, and I'm going to give you 8-10 minutes each, and then I may have a question or two, and if not, I'll open it up to the audience as soon as I run out of questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure for me to be here again. As Michael said, SAIS and the Dialogue are partnering up on several events on Brazil, and we're going to continue that partnership going forward. So look to more events that we will co-sponsor and co-host either here or over at SAIS. I don't know where to start exactly, but let me try to well, where is the beginning? But let me try to give you a sense of where, at least on the side of the economy of Brazil, where things stand at the moment, what we have seen come out of the administration so far, where that's likely to head, and then I'll kind of try to wrap that up with some impressions about how the talks could go here and whether it leads or not, in light of the many problems and many challenges that Brazil's facing, whether or not, you know, we can expect real progress in the relationship between Brazil and the U.S., specifically in the area of trade, but also in the area of investment, you know, whether we're going to see any progress there. I mean, we know that both Brazil and the U.S. have been dancing around each other for many, many years. The relationship is cordial, but it never really leads anywhere. So are we at a juncture here where we might expect something different or not? Let me start with the economy and some thoughts on that. So the Brazilian economy, as I think probably all of you know, is facing some very harsh fiscal challenges in the short to medium term horizon. At the federal level, the fiscal deficit is high. The public debt to GDP ratio is very high as well. At the subnational level, things are no better. Actually, things are somewhat worse. There are many states that are either in a declared state of financial calamity or heading in that direction. So it's hard to overstate how big and how challenging these fiscal problems are. As you know, these fiscal problems do require at least one very big reform that's been talked about extensively over the last 4 or 5 years, but if we go back in time, it's always really been on the agenda, and this is the pension reform. The pension reform would address a significant chunk of these fiscal challenges that Brazil has, both at the federal as well as at the state level, if done properly. But as with all of these types of reforms, it is a very unpopular reform and a very controversial reform. The Bolsonaro cabinet, so the minister, the economy minister, Mr. Paulo Guedes, who has taken over several aspects of the economic management of Brazil. So he's not just the finance minister, he's also in charge now of trade and commerce and a host of other issues, because in planning and the budget and everything, because the finance ministry has been consolidated with two other ministries. He faces this really harsh task of pushing the pension reform through and trying to get, something reasonable approved by Congress. The pension reform, the blueprint for the pension reform was presented a couple of weeks ago. Then soon after that, the full plan came out, and it's already been sent to Congress. The first impression that I had looking at it was that the pension reform was actually quite a good one. It's more aggressive than the one that the Temer administration had proposed in 2016, and that ended up going nowhere. It got severely diluted in Congress, as tends to be the case with these types of reforms. And looking at, sort of the political environment in Brazil, I have a bit of a contrarian view when I see the way that some people seem to think that, this reform is going to get through Congress and it's not going to face a lot of challenges, and the government's not going to have too many difficulties. My contrarian view is, if Temer, who was someone who knew very well how Congress worked, who was, had been himself a congressional operative for a very long time, knew how to build coalitions, knew how to do all of these things. If he wasn't able to push his pension reform through, why should we think that it's going to be any different with Bolsonaro? Now, there may be reasons to think that, he has a higher chance because he's a newly elected president. He's still at that stage where there's some level of a honeymoon between him and Congress. There's been a lot of shift in Congress. There was a lot of renovation with the incoming Congress members. However, pension reform and economics reforms more broadly were never a topic of discussion during the campaign. And that makes, approving this reform already very difficult, because there's at least a significant segment, I'd say, of the Bolsonaro electorate that wasn't really looking for pension reform. And so there's already a lot of pressure coming on this issue, and I expect that to continue as we go forward. In addition to that, and I think Matthias will touch upon these points, and then we'll do a back and forth between ourselves. There's been a lot. We are at the 2.5, just about the 2.5 month mark, and it's hard to overstate the amount of political noise on the ground right now. Anyone who's following Brazil closely knows that for a while, the whole thing is, the whole situation kind of feels like a soap opera sometimes. And in fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that. And the political turbulence and the political noise on the ground is very much like that. A lot of it being created by the president himself, but also by those who surround him. And those who surround him include his family, his sons, who are all elected officials and who have, been very vocal on certain issues like the family values agenda, the very ultra-conservative ideological agenda. And, that kind of noise, when you have to pass a reform as important as the pension reform, tends to be counterproductive. So this is another reason why, when I look at this whole setup, it just feels like, this is a process. Approving this reform is going to take much longer, perhaps, than people currently believe, and it might yet lead to severe dilution of the reform, which might not actually do what it might. We might end up with something that doesn't really do the trick when it comes to fiscal consolidation that the pension reform would need to do. So that's one area of concern and big concern. And if that doesn't happen, then Brazil will be in a troublesome situation. With all of that, and the political noise, the pension reform, all of these big agenda topics that Brazil has to deal with, it appears to me that, the trip next week and what we're going to see out of the trip next week is a great opportunity for optics on both sides, on the Brazilian side as well as on the U.S. side. It's a great opportunity for the Bolsonaro administration to, proclaim that it's closer to the United States than any previous Brazilian administration has ever been, whatever that comes out to mean. But I quite frankly don't really expect much in the way of actual progress on the areas that we would like to see progress on. So namely on, greater trade integration, trade facilitation, as well as investment facilitation measures and things of that sort. The relationship between Brazil and the U.S. over the past several years has been marked by, very minute sort of tinkering around the edges policy things when you look at both trade and investment. And I don't really expect that to change. There will be, some strong showing of support for Brazil in several ways that the U.S. might do, just as it did with President Macri when he was first elected and came to the U.S. Quite frankly, I don't see it going much beyond that, including because the Bolsonaro administration itself doesn't really know what it wants. I mean, when you actually try to think through, what is it that Brazil wants out of the Brazil-U.S. relationship, which is something that the U.S. has been asking Brazil to explain for quite a long time. I don't really think Brazil has anything coherent to say. Because the trade, investment, openness, broader openness agenda simply hasn't been there. And currently within his cabinet, and I'll end here, there are divergent views when it comes to trade. And this is not just trade with the U.S., this is trade more broadly. So you have, on the one hand, the economy minister, Paulo Guedes, who has a pro-trade view and is opening up the Brazilian market and reducing a lot of the protectionism that Brazil currently has. It is one of the most closed economies in the world when you look at the levels of protectionism that it has. Not the tariff levels, but particularly the non-tariff stuff like local content requirements and things like that. But on the other hand, there is a foreign relations minister who also has the trade agenda. The trade agenda is kind of split between several different areas within the Brazilian government. And he is a self-declared anti-globalist, whatever that means. And so one would think that, these two ministers are at some point going to come into conflict when it comes to discussing the broader trade agenda. And in addition to that, it's not clear whether that agenda is even a priority, given all of the problems that I outlined earlier on in my remarks. So I'm not very optimistic at all. I think, as I said, just summarizing, it's going to be a good visit. There will be a lot of showing of support back and forth. Whether it goes much beyond that, I think I wouldn't expect that to happen.
Can I ask one small question? What happens if the pension reform does not go well? Is that really going to reshape the way people think about Bolsonaro, the economics community, the international? In other words, is this sort of an absolutely crucial point in it could be an inversion of the politics?
Yeah, I think it could be a huge inflection point. So we have seen to date, the private sector in Brazil, but also the private sector outside of Brazil, financial markets in particular, looking at this government as a government that can actually push through this reform as opposed to what happened under the Temer administration. And all the optimism that we have seen with respect to Brazil relies solely on passing the pension reform. And with that in mind, if the pension reform does not pass, or if it's passed in a severely diluted way, I think that will be an inflection point and sentiment will turn. What happens after that? Well, given that the fiscal situation is extremely difficult, what you would see is a lot of market turbulence. Brazil doesn't have on its sort of its fiscal challenges are not like Argentina's in the sense that, Brazil does not have external vulnerabilities tied to the fiscal problem. So in that way, it's very different. So there wouldn't be necessarily any external spillover apart from obviously currency devaluation and, market turbulence that leads to that. But but what one would likely see is, just what one has already started to see, because the market is internalizing the fact that, a portion of this reform at least is going to get diluted, is a shortening of the maturity of the debt, and, just more difficulties in rolling over the debt, a spike in interest rates on Brazilian bonds, that kind of thing. And that could be very disruptive, because let's remember where we are. This is an economy that's been growing at 1% for the past 2 years after having faced a very severe recession in 2015 and 2016. And there are absolutely no signs that growth can actually pick up strongly from that level. So best case, you pass a pension reform, everybody's happy. Probably Brazil's going to grow around 1.5% this year. So anything that slips off of that could actually put the country back into a situation where, it's knife edge whether or not it falls back into a recession or not. So this is really quite crucial. And politically, it generates that inflection point that I talked about.
Now for an alternative view.
I agree entirely. We can go home. Let's have breakfast. This was great. Such a treat to be back. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to share the podium with you two guys. Thanks a lot. So I agree mostly, I think, with Monica. Let me give you a slightly alternative angle. This visit is crucial for Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro's made it a point to be the first president in 30 years of democratic experience to do his first bilateral international visit, to come to the United States and not go to Argentina. And he made it a point. And the reason why is that he needs the United States very badly. He needs the United States under the positive scenario, which is we're going to see pension reform in 2019, and then you need American support to have the economy turn around and pick up some momentum. Growing at 1.5% or 2% would be wonderful for Brazil, given the record of the last few years. And given the fact that unemployment is incredibly high, it's very hard to bring it down, and taking into account the fact that Bolsonaro and the family are working already on the municipal elections that are going to take place next year. They are the bellwether for 2022, when we have the next presidential elections. That's the positive scenario. The negative scenario is one in which either we don't pass pension reform, or the pension reform that gets passed is so diluted that it doesn't resolve the fiscal problem. And I agree entirely with Monica's assessment. The political fallout of that assessment is really terrible, because although we will not see an Argentina situation, because Brazilian debt is denominated in Brazilian reais, not dollars, we would find the fiscal authorities, the monetary authorities in Brazil, with very little room for maneuver other than devaluing the currency. And the moment that happens, inflation kicks in. And if we've learned anything from Brazilian politics in the last 30 years, is that those presidents who preside over an inflationary cycle, they're screwed, their administration is gone. So in that situation, the United States becomes super important for Bolsonaro. And all of the signals and all of the optics are rather crucial, because when push comes to shove, you will find the Brazilian Minister of the Economy of the day at the Treasury Department, asking for support, doing the rounds in Wall Street. And for all of that, getting Washington support is not an option, is a necessity. That's the first thing. The second thing is to do with Bolsonaro's base. Bolsonaro won with a very clear majority. Not only did he win with over 10 million votes, which is very significant, but he carried the 4 biggest federal states on his coattails. He managed to elect the largest caucus in Congress as well on his coattails. So incredibly popular. But he does not have a party base. He does not have an alliance. He is a minority president. And now he's having to put together a government on the back of 3 very different groups. There's the socially conservatives, very influenced by the rise of evangelism in Brazilian politics. There's the military, and there is the Chicago boys and the financial markets. What brings these three groups together now is a willingness to get closer to the United States. Coming to the United States, getting a reception from the White House that he can sell at home as a big win, as recognition that he is a leader in South America at a moment in which there aren't many, is important for him because it brings together these very different groups. There will be something for the socially conservatives, and we're going to hear a lot of that. And I'm sure President Bolsonaro will congratulate himself with Trump on ending 30 years of socialism in Brazil, and that kind of language. President Bolsonaro on the 18th is meeting a network of Christian activists, and we're going to see a lot of that coming out of the visit. But also, there's going to be talk for the financial markets. And for the financial markets, knowing that Bolsonaro has the backing of the White House is very important in a year that is bound to be bumpy, because passing this reform is not going to be easy, because as Monica said, it's so unpopular. And not only that, he does not have a solid majority in Congress. And then there's the third element, and that's the military. So there is a dimension to this visit that no one talks about, but to me is rather essential, and it's geopolitics. Brazil now is in a bad shape geopolitically because it has this massive external challenge that it never had before. It doesn't have the instruments to manage that challenge, and that is the fact that very porous borders have turned Brazil into a massive center for illegal drug-related activity. So if you look at the last UN report on drugs, you will find that Brazil is now the single largest port of export of cocaine in South America. That's partly to do with trade diversion after Plan Colombia. So the production of cocaine moved from Colombia to Peru and Bolivia, and then it goes out into the Atlantic via the port of Santos in São Paulo, but also via the port of Recife and Salvador in northeast Brazil. That, of course, fuels illegal campaign finance. So you have a lot of mayors and city councilors in cities in the border zone that get elected with illicit funds. And you end up having this sort of corridor of illicit activity from the borders Brazil shares with Paraguay and Bolivia and the port of Santos. Managing that is absolute hell. Add to that the fact that there are very clear signs that Venezuela might become a narco state, and then you have a situation for Brazil that Brazil never encountered before. So we're going to find this visit, during the visit, we're going to hear a lot about the willingness to fight narcotics. I'm not suggesting Bolsonaro wants a Plan Brazil, nor that a Plan Brazil is in the works in any way. But what we do know is that the very little money the federal budget has for security, defense-related stuff is going to be invested heavily in border security. So we can expect new biddings to try and contract services to do with border zoning, satellite imagery, cybersecurity. There's a new push between Bolsonaro and the Macri administration in Argentina to try and get the border zone together. It's a very complicated border area. So there we have it. Three big themes. The socially conservative agenda that is essential for Bolsonaro because it's the core base he needs to keep mobilized all the time, so the tweets are not going to stop. There's the financial markets, and he needs to reassure them all the time, in particular now that we're going to hear all the bad news about pension reform. Now is the moment in which the government gets hit in Congress all the time. It loses its whips. The whips prove to be inefficient. He needs to change whips, a couple of times in the next 6 months, perhaps. Polls will suggest that the people do not support the reform. This is the worst time. And we can see volatility in the markets already. So getting the backing from Trump is so important. And then the military. And there will be a military side to the visit that is very significant. And it's significant as well, of course, because on the American side, the visit is not at all about Brazil. It's about Venezuela, right? What Trump wants to hear when he sees Bolsonaro is not, Trump is not interested in Brazilian pension reform. And he's not concerned about the port of Santos. He's concerned, and understandably, with the situation in Venezuela. And although Brazil has limited instruments to contribute to the situation in Venezuela, Brazilian political support has been essential in putting together a very powerful, remarkable actually, coalition to support Guaido, to put pressure on the regime. And frankly, I think people in Washington, as people in Brasilia, understand fully well that if they don't ramp up pressure now, if pressure sort of dies in the next 2 months, and there's no change on the ground, then we've lost a massive opportunity. So I think Bolsonaro will say all the right things. I would suggest you read a remarkable interview Vice President Mourão gave this morning to the Financial Times, in which he lays out the terms which I think Bolsonaro is going to bring to the Oval Office. So that's my take. On the issue of the economy, the situation, I agree with Monica on that, and I think that's a message that needs to circulate more in Washington. People underestimate the degree to which Brazil is in a bad place fiscally. If there's no reform, early next year we're going to have government shutdown. There will be no money in the kitty to pay for anything other than salaries, pensions. The machine of government will grind to a halt. And at a time that poverty levels in Brazil have not been going down, that's really worrying. In the aftermath of an election in which the people voted with anger, the dominant sentiment in the 2018 election was anger, and understandably, if the political class cannot provide solutions, if we do not have an economy that turns around, if unemployment doesn't come down, then we're in real trouble, because every poll says Brazilians do not trust their political institutions. They trust the military, and they trust the churches, in the plural, of all denominations. The minute trust in those institutions begins to go down, and that's a real danger now because there are so many military men in the Bolsonaro administration, I think we're in serious trouble and we should worry about the future of Brazilian politics quite seriously.
Thank you. Terrific introduction. Have it all written down here. So let me just ask, neither of you has mentioned China in the discussion. And it seems to me China now is overwhelmingly the largest trading partner of Brazil, may be the largest potential source of investment. One of the sort of centers of power for the Bolsonaro that you may not have mentioned, the rural coalitions, sort of depend on China. This is there. And of course, one of the foreign policy objectives of the U.S. appears to be is to reduce China's footprint in Latin America. And Brazil has to be a major part of that if they're going to be a serious reduction. Do you have any sort of feel for how China is going to sort of interfere in the U.S. relationship, in the politics of Brazil? You want to start off?
Thanks, and thank you, Peter, for that question, because I was thinking about that as, I was speaking, as Matthias was speaking, and that was the one issue that neither one of us raised. I think the China question puts Brazil in a really challenging place. Because yes, I think you're absolutely right. The U.S. is also, the visit will be surely from the U.S. side about Venezuela, but it will also be about China to some extent. Particularly given that, we're in the midst of talks between the U.S. and China to do something about the trade war that's currently taking place. So I expect there to be, some kind of pressure coming from the U.S. to know exactly where Brazil stands. And here's where the situation gets very tricky for Bolsonaro, because within his base of support, you have the ultra-conservative religious right in Brazil that views China very ideologically, so basically falls on the same side as Trump on China-related issues. And then you have, the technocrats, where I include Paulo Guedes, but also, apart from people in the government, of course, the agribusiness community, which has a significant caucus within Congress and is thus very important also for getting the pension reform passed. Those are, that side of the equation really views the relationship with China as being absolutely paramount to keep Brazil more or less on track. I mean, without China, forget growth, because, this is mostly where Brazil, the agribusiness sector, even though as a share GDP, it's not large, it is a sector that actually moves a whole production chain within Brazil. So if you look at, not the direct links between sort of growth and how agribusiness is doing, but all of the indirect links in this production network that the agribusiness sector, sort of moves around in the economy, it really is very crucial. And, just to really drive the point home, when you look at what happened in 2015, 2016, 2017, so we know that we had recessions in 15 and 16. The only reason those recessions were not worse was because actually we had very good years for agricultural exports for those 2 years. And in 2017, practically the entire reason for why the economy staged growth of 1% had to do with the performance of the agribusiness sector. So this is a massively important sector that relies very heavily on China. It won't be the U.S. buying agricultural exports from Brazil. It'll continue to be China. And as you said, China has been increasingly also diversifying its investments in the region. And right now, if you look at, the spectrum of sectors where China is investing in Brazil, it's pretty much, sort of widening, and it's not just doing, investments in what it views as strategic sectors for itself, but it's also getting into the financial sector and doing investments in other areas. So Brazil really needs China economically, and how it's going to deal with the pressures coming out of the potentially coming out of the Trump administration without a coherent view amongst the ministers who are going to accompany Bolsonaro here, I think is a really big question mark. I don't know.
Let me have a couple of thoughts on the China issue. And actually, the China issue is not just China, it's also Israel. Israel and China, for Bolsonaro, operate under the same lens, and it's to do with the Trump administration. So during the campaign, Bolsonaro said time and again that China did not want to buy in Brazil, that China wanted to buy Brazil. And the reason he said that was because at the time, the Chinese were very active purchasing bits of the pre-salt oil that was up for sale at the time, but also buying a third of energy distribution in the northeast part of Brazil. And there was a belief in the Bolsonaro administration that Trump was serious about China and Latin America. When I think it was Vice President Pence who first referred to the Monroe Doctrine in speaking about China, and then President Trump echoed the same kind of language, that really resonated with the Bolsonaro team because they understood, and I think it's a correct assessment, that Trump means business. I mean, if you ask any representative of a Central American country, they will tell you how pushy the U.S. have been on the issue of China, and wanting to see that countries in the region take practical measures to slow down the growth of the Chinese presence in the region. Of course, there is an exaggeration in what Bolsonaro says about China in Brazil. China is number 13 in terms of the stock of investment in Brazil, but of course it is expanding very rapidly, and as Monica said, a percentage point in which, a slowdown in China by a percentage point produces unemployment in the state of Minas Gerais. So that's a problem, right? The way I see it is this. I don't know whether it's going to come up in the visit or not, but my sense is this. Brazil will not kick China out because it cannot afford to do so. it would be very stupid for Brazil in any way to suspend the flow of Chinese investment at a time when Brazil is willing to sell several state companies. If you take the Chinese out of the equation, the sheer price of the Brazilian assets will plummet. You don't want to do that. But the compromise solution, I think, will be to set up a screening mechanism where you have various Brazilian ministers, including the military, pre-approving every Chinese investment in sensitive areas. The Germans have that model, and the United States has that model. I think the very bureaucratic acronym is CFIUS. CFIUS. So I reckon Brazil will come up with something like that. Let me segue to Israel, because I think the connection is an important one. Bolsonaro has been signaling since the campaign that he wants to reorient Brazilian policy to the Middle East. He's been insisting that sympathy to the Arab world is a thing of the Brazilian left, although factually that's incorrect. It's a policy designed by the Brazilian military, backed in dictatorship days, 1967. But he's been saying that. The Brazilian left, during the campaign, visited Hebron. The leading candidate from PSOL visited Hebron. So that polarized debate around foreign policy. And of course, Bolsonaro has a commitment to Israel because Brazilian evangelicals have turned Israel into a destiny of their preference. Bolsonaro was rebaptized in the waters of the River Jordan, so on and so forth. But there is something else. There is an expectation, there is a belief in the Bolsonaro team that Trump will expect movement on that front. So Bolsonaro, after the campaign, in the early days of the administration, made several commitments to moving Brazil's embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, to the shock and horror of the Brazilian military. Again, I think what we're going to see is a compromise solution. I don't know whether it's going to come up in this visit. It might take longer. But I think the compromise solution will be something of the following nature. Brazil commits to eventually changing the embassy, and President Bolsonaro, in the course of his first term in power, will set the cornerstone of the future embassy of Brazil in Jerusalem to be defined one day in the future. I think it's important not to underestimate the degree to which signals that come from Washington shape the Bolsonaro's team understanding of what it is they need to do in order to have a good visit. And they seem to be very willing to do it. Sometimes they overdo it. Sometimes they read the signals incorrectly. Bolsonaro is having Steve Bannon come for dinner to the Brazilian embassy the night of the 17th. One would wonder why. And the answer is that if you ask, many people in the Bolsonaro circle will tell you that they believe this will improve the quality of their relationship with Trump. I think that's a mistaken assumption. But the rationale behind it is to do with their willingness to have a very good visit. And that is based on the understanding that, as Monica pointed it out, past visits from Brazilian presidents to the United States frustrated expectations on both sides. And that is so true.
Monica, did you want to?
No, I just wanted to add a point since we talked about agribusiness and the agribusiness sector. The Israel question, of course, is something that's also harmful to the agribusiness sector in Brazil, as we've seen from the reaction out of Middle Eastern countries that buy a lot of meat products from Brazil after the announcement of these intentions. So what I would expect is that if there is some kind of compromise move, even if it's just symbolic, as you outlined, it would still be the case, I think, that, the agribusiness sector would be horrified and would be trying to walk that back, because there will be retaliation from the Middle East countries.
I have one more question to ask, but then I'm going to open it up, so prepare yourselves. Matthias, this is also directed to you, Monica, but Matthias mentioned that President Bolsonaro won by a healthy margin which he did, particularly in Brazilian politics. It was a healthy margin. But still, the opposition, after, sort of a rather dismal performance in the last period, won 45% of the vote. And that vote was, the 45% came in stronger measure from the areas that were poorer in the Northeast, more Afro-Brazilian, etc. The question I have, and which would be interesting to hear a bit, is what is the opposition? Is there any opposition forming? Any coherent way to the Bolsonaro government now? And, so we asked that here about, is there in the Democratic Party any coherent opposition to Trump? Is there anything that you see emerging that you would see as a serious opposition, and how much does it, and what does its success or failure depend on?
So the opposition is not articulated in Brazil right now. The PT has been, I think, it is drifting and isn't really going anywhere, and has been, wasting time defending the Maduro regime and doing all sorts of other things that are meaningless in the current context, and which actually resonate very badly in Brazil as well. Ciro Gomes is sort of trying to paint himself as the leader of the opposition, but of course, he's currently having constant fights with the PT. So it doesn't seem like that is going to go anywhere. So yeah, the opposition is somewhat dismantled at this point. What I would say, however, is that there's one very interesting thing. When you look at Brazil and you sort of compare, what happened during the 2018 elections, and then you sort of, want to find echoes of what's happening now in Brazil with, and the similarities with what's happened here in the U.S., you find many of these types of similarities, even though you have to take into account that these are completely different countries and totally different, with totally different social and political dynamics. But having said that, there's one really interesting thing that we see happening in Brazil, and that's the role of the press and how the traditional press is actually behaving. So what we saw here in the U.S. and we continue to see is that very clearly, at least when it comes to, how the press has been dealing with Trump, you have a camp within the press that is clearly anti-Trump, and you have a camp within the press that is clearly pro-Trump. So, the press is sort of divided, if we can put it that way. It's not like that in Brazil. And what we have seen out of, especially out of the last 2.5 months, and increasingly so, is that the press has taken pretty much a unified front in criticizing Bolsonaro. Now, they're not criticizing Bolsonaro on the economic policies per se, which had always been the traditional role of the media, in criticizing economic policies coming out of governments. This is not what they're doing. What they're doing is just criticizing every single misstep that Bolsonaro does, and he's done a lot of missteps in the last 2.5 months. And it's particularly interesting to see some portions of the Brazilian press, which have always been identified with traditional conservatism, not the ultra-conservatism of this religious right that has appeared, or not appeared, because they've been there for a while, but they have become more prominent, with the election of Bolsonaro. So it's not those that we're talking about. We're talking about the traditional conservatives. That part of the press, which represents and which gives voice to that part of the Brazilian establishment, has been very, very critical of Bolsonaro, to the point where you see scathing editorials every single day over the last 2 months. So I think when we speak of opposition, on the political side, the opposition, on the political party side, the opposition is kind of dismantled. But the opposition that's coming out of the press is really very dramatic, and has been very aggressive, and has been trying to push back on Bolsonaro every time he steps in this ideological direction. Now, to just say something about that the press has also been reacting to is, of course, all the tweeting and all the, the press is the enemy of the people kind of speech that Bolsonaro is constantly making. The thing, again, that's different about Brazil is that even though he says that, it has affected it differently from what we've seen in the U.S., where part of the press doesn't seem to care about that when Trump says it. In Brazil, the entire press cares about it. So the press has really been the opposition force so far, and it is the press that is uncovering a lot of things as well as we go forward. So I expect them to continue to play that role, and it's going to get very tricky as we go forward.
Yeah, emphasis on tricky. So during the election, Bolsonaro won with a healthy majority, but of course the anti-Bolsonaro vote was very significant, which is understandable, right? Bolsonaro is a divisive figure, so this is bound to happen in all the elections in which Bolsonaro runs from now on. And it is true, there is no articulated opposition acting as one because the opposition is all divided. The opposition hasn't even managed to come up with an answer to the question what we do with Lula, who's in prison. And nothing suggests the opposition will get its act together anytime soon. But now, one way to read that is to say, well, then Bolsonaro has an easy outlook in the next 4 years and re-election looks very plausible. And if not re-election for himself, then maybe electing one of his sons. But there is another side to that coin, and that's the fact that the Brazilian political system is not bipartisan like here. So not having a united opposition is not the key thing for you to understand whether government can survive or not. Is a very fractured, unloyal base in parliament. And Bolsonaro's made a decision during the campaign, and this was calculated on the back of the anger that people felt with Brazil's all-time politics. He said, I will not do what every other democratic president has done from Cardoso onwards, which is to get the federal government, slice it up between the parties from the base, parties that have no ideological coherence whatsoever, parties that have no commitment to delivering on the president's agenda, but parties who agree to exchange votes for pork, and thanks to Lava Jato, we now know illegal campaign funding as well. Bolsonaro said, I'm breaking with that world. But we haven't changed the rules of the electoral game. So Bolsonaro has really two choices. Either he restores the old ways, and this week looks as if he might restore the old ways, because now he has to pass pension reform. Members of parliament are asking for pork, and now they've gotten a big chunk of pork this week. Or he needs to go full plebiscitarian, which means lives on Facebook, mobilizing the base, getting the people to support change. The problem is, of course, pension reform is not popular. It's not something people go out on the streets to support. So popularity becomes central for Bolsonaro. And on that front, the last 2.5 months have not been 2.5 months of good news. The poll taken by Datafolha in December suggested 63% support for the president. We don't have latest figures, but we have a different poll. It's a poll which asks people, do you believe this administration is doing an excellent job, a so-so job, a bad job? And the excellent job is 38% of the people. That's the lowest number in the last 30 years. That is to say, Cardoso, Lula, and then Dilma had higher numbers at this time in their administrations. So it's going to be a bumpy road, even if there is no united opposition. Whether that will then breed a new leadership remains to be seen. But I agree entirely with Monica. It doesn't look that way now.
Well, we're now open for your questions. I see them popping up. I'm going to take 3 questions. Let's start with young lady here.
I have a sample of one.
Oh, tell us who you are and,
Sorry, I'm Kathy Healy. I'm involved with K-12, connecting classrooms K-12 in the Americas with each other in the world. And I'd like to know more specifics when you say pension reform, what the pension situation is in Brazil. I have a sample of one friend who retired, a bureaucrat, at 75% of his salary, and then he got prostate cancer. He's alive many, many years later, but under the rules, as he explained it, he went to 100% of his working salary for his pension. Could somebody please explain a little bit more to me beyond my sample of one?
let's go over here, please. Tell us your name and.
Thank you very much. Isaac Maya from Free Balance. Why start with a big ticket item like pension reform? Why not a quick win? Say, for example, US, Brazil visa requirements. That would bring in a lot of capital. Also, are we not going to talk about Petrobras at all? No mention?
Petrobras is doing great. That's what we can say about it.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kevin Ivers from DCI Group. I had a question in terms of you talked about the three parts of the political base, but isn't the real margin for his victory and really the margin in both rounds of last year's election the middle class? And isn't the real measure of his ability to hang on his understanding when he has to mobilize them? And they're not the religious right, they're not the Chicago boys, and they're not in the BBB coalition. They're the taxi drivers. You know, they're the folks who voted for him in huge numbers. And what does the terrible video he posted on Twitter at the end of Carnival say about his understanding of what they care about?
Oh, boy, that's a tough question. Why don't you start as Monica?
Okay.
Pension reform, why?
Try to address all three. So let me start with yours, which is actually the most difficult of all, because Brazil's pension system is exceedingly complex. And there are a bunch of rules, and it's very hard to understand, and it's very hard to explain in just a few words. The problem is that the current system, as it stands, and by the way that it's been designed in the 1988 Constitution, is a system that, due to several reasons, including Brazilian demographics and the fact that the population's aging and in a defined benefit, regime, you need the labor force to be ever growing in order to sustain a system as generous as Brazil has, because it is those people who are currently working who are paying for the pensions of those who are currently retiring. So that system, in the way that it was designed in the 1988 Constitution, is no longer sustainable. One of the reasons is that this workforce is at some point, we're not at that point yet, but at some point that workforce is not going to be growing, well, if we are at this point, it's not going to be growing at the same rate that it was growing in the past because the population's aging. So you have a smaller base of people to sustain a growth at the higher end of the age distribution, so more elderly people, to sustain those people who are now retiring. That makes the system completely unsustainable, and it means that, the current deficit that the system has is going to grow over time. On top of that, both on the civil servant side, because Brazil has two separate pension systems, there's one for private sector workers and there's one for public servants. On the public servant side, there are excessive benefits built into the structure of the system. So there are some civil servants who end up having the ability to accumulate benefits. All of that, when you sort of put all of this together, it means that currently Brazil is spending about 10% of GDP with pensions alone. And that number is going to grow very fast in the next few years because of these issues that I described. So because of demographics, because of all of that. So bottom line is, you really need a reform in order to make the system sustainable. You also need a reform to make the system less, the current system generates a lot, well, it adds to a lot of income inequality, because the way that it works is that, you know, at the top, people who earn more tend to be able to accumulate more benefits, especially on the public pension side. So you just can't have it all. So you need to not just address the deficit, but you also need to build some progressiveness into the pension system, which is what the current reform that's been presented tries to do. So it addresses the deficit, and it addresses also this issue of, you know, having excessive benefits being granted to people who already earn high salaries. The problem is that what the current system, what the new pension system would do, by having now set minimum retirement ages and, you know, a bunch of other new requirements within the system, is that it would, for somebody in the private sector, for example, the public sector is less of an issue, but in the private sector, for somebody to actually earn 100% of their benefits, they would have to work continuously for 40 years, which is not something that most Brazilians can actually do. Most Brazilians, especially in the lower middle class and the poor, and even within the middle class, but the lower middle class and the poor, they drop in and out of the labor market constantly. So when you look at the figures, you see that people are constantly going in and out. They lose their jobs. They go to some informal job where they're not formally contributing in any way. And then, you know, so you don't have that continuity. And this is an issue that, if we were going to have a rational discussion about the pension reform, is certainly an issue that should be addressed. I don't expect that we're going to have a rational discussion about pension reform, so I don't think this issue is going to be addressed. So in a nutshell, this is where we are now and where we may be moving to if this pension reform is approved in the way that it was designed. But as I said, and as Matias said, likely what's going to happen is that portions of the current pension reform are going to be diluted, changed, or, you know, whatever is going to happen throughout the process of the pension reform circulating in Congress. So it's very hard to say what we're actually going to end up with. But these are the challenges and these are the difficulties. I don't remember your question anymore.
Why?
Oh, why start with pension reform? Well, there's no other, that's a constraint. There's no other way. You have to start with the pension reform, because even though there may be low-hanging fruit, so to speak, such as the one that you mentioned, they don't generate the kind of the room for maneuver in economic management that Brazil needs. Brazil currently has no room for maneuver. That's the problem. I mean, when you look at the fiscal situation, there's no room to maneuver anything. So you need to start with that reform. And I agree. I mean, it would be easier if it were something else. On the other hand, you know, this is the window of time that you have when you are newly elected to actually do something meaningful. And the one meaningful thing that Brazil needs to do is pension reform. So that's where we are. On Petrobras, Petrobras has been significantly cleaned up. And the situation of the company right now is, there's been a huge improvement. I mean, this is at least one very positive legacy of the Temer administration. And when we look at the spectrum of state-owned oil companies in the world right now, no one's worried about Petrobras. Everybody's worried about Pemex, state oil company in Mexico. So that's where we are. And then to your question, which I think was the right on target, you're absolutely right. When you look at this Bolsonaro electorate, there is a base, you know, this ultra-conservative right wing. And actually, when you look at some numbers, and I did that, when you look at census data by municipality, this is census data as of 2010, because there hasn't been another census yet. And then when you look at, you know, the votes that went for Bolsonaro in each of these municipalities in the runoff, you see a very clear correlation between the share of evangelicals. I'm putting all of them in the same bunch, which isn't altogether right, but let's just go with that. The share, the higher the share of evangelicals in a given municipality, the more the votes went for Bolsonaro. So you see this really clear correlation between, the share of the evangelical population in a given municipality and how well Bolsonaro did in the runoff. But that's a small base, comparatively speaking, when you look at Brazil as a whole, right? And we know that what motivated the 2018 elections was anger, as Matias said, and anger that transformed into this broad anti-PT sentiment, the sentiment that we do not want the PT back because the PT represents everything that went wrong with the country, notably the corruption scandals, but also, the reason why the economy is not doing well, and, people just put all of that in the same basket. Whether they're right to do that and blame it all on the PT is a separate question that I'm not going to address, but that's where we are. These people are not the diehard ultra-conservative religious right. These are, as you said, regular folk, and yes, taxi drivers, who are always a very good thermometer of what's happening on the ground. Could they, start to view Bolsonaro negatively very soon? Yes, for several reasons. The first one being, this whole ideological agenda and crusade, because we have to put it in those terms that some people within the Bolsonaro cabinet and Bolsonaro himself seem to be on, is not really the crusade that the bulk of his electorate is really interested in pursuing. B, he promised that he would fight crime. And he promised to deliver very fast on that agenda, that being the reason why he called Sergio Moro to be not just his Minister of Justice, but also gave him the public security portfolio and merged those ministries. Now, are we likely to see significant progress in that area very fast? No, because the issue there has to do with local finances and the capacity of the states and the municipalities to actually respond to these security challenges, as opposed to, the federal government coming up with some magic plan that's going to resolve everything. So if that particular situation doesn't get resolved anytime soon, and if people feel that that's going nowhere, that the agenda has been mostly, the announcement of plans without actually seeing concrete results on the ground and concrete improvements in their lives, Bolsonaro's popularity could go down very fast, which is a very big risk for him. More than the economy, I'd say. Being an economist, I'd say that's a bigger risk than unemployment not coming down and people starting to see him as not being the person they thought would deliver on the promises that he made. So I think when you look at the question that you raised specifically, the chances that a rapid drop in popularity could materialize relatively soon they're pretty high.
Do you want me to comment on the tweet? Is that what you want from me?
Whatever you
I'm not going to talk
want to
about
add anything to or disagree or.
Let me tackle the issue of the middle class, which is so central, ending up with the tweet. In the run-up to Carnival, Bolsonaro had 4 bad news. This poll came out showing 38% support. The figures for unemployment came out. Most people thought there would be an improvement, but the results showed a deterioration situation. One of the key advisors to one of his sons had to produce evidence, written evidence, to the Office of the National Prosecutor to the effect that the cabinet of the son at the state legislature of Rio de Janeiro was engaging in illicit activity, 2 types of illegal activities. Very bad news, all 3. And then Carnival started. And during Carnival, in most large Brazilian cities, unprompted, masses of people on the streets started chanting and using really aggressive language towards the president. The same kind of language they used against Dilma during Dilma's worst time in the run-up to the Olympic Games and the World Cup. That caught everyone by surprise, the fact that these were spontaneous uproars of public anger, a president who's newly elected. The tweet comes out in the context of that, and I think The tweet illustrates a pattern, and the pattern is this is a presidency that is entirely reliant on popularity and on mobilizing the base. And they don't have many great instruments to do that. They don't have a party machine to get out support on the ground. What they have is social media. And we're going to see the use of social media to try and ramp up middle-class support. But they're learning as they're doing it. Remember, no one in the Bolsonaro team thought a year ago they could win this thing. And they now run the 5th largest democracy in the world. They're learning by doing, and he overplayed his hand. And I think everyone accepts around him now that that tweet was a big mistake. But that does not mean we will not see more tweets. Because in many respects, to keep up support and to keep up the base alive, all they've got now is the tweets. If the economy turns around and growth resumes and unemployment comes down, then that's a different story. But unless we get to that position, we're going to see this kind of democracy, and you guys in this country know about it.
Too well. Andrei, tell us who you are.
Thank you, Peter. Andrei Paltovets from Embassy of Russia. Everyone mentioned different bases, groups. Monica specifically mentioned disagreements between Guedes and Araujo. I can add that I see some disagreements between Vice President Murillo and some with Guedes, more with Araujo. Could you elaborate more how it's going to play out in terms of foreign policy in general and specifically between the U.S. and Brazilian relations? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara Stallings, Brown University and GW. I would have asked about China, but I think Peter did a good job of drawing out that discussion already. Make a tiny point about that and then ask a different question. The tiny point further complicates the discussion between Trump and Bolsonaro with respect to China and agribusiness. I'm sure that Trump thinks that Brazil has been unfair competition in stepping in to sell more soybeans when the U.S. market was semi-closed. But the question I want to ask is about the role that local business is playing in all of this. And one has to obviously disaggregate into large business, small business, sectors, regions, whatever. But can you say anything about business as a whole or particular groups of business? And I'm also interested in if it's true that BNDES is being shrunk, how does that fit into the business view of the government?
Thank you, Barbara.
Michael, you had a question. This might have to be the last question, so it better be a good one.
I don't know if it's a good one. It has to do with your previous answers, but it's just, it's sort of hanging out there for me. Going back to the visit, is Trump popular in Brazil? And is Trump popular with Bolsonaro's base, with these taxi drivers? Do they like what he's doing? What is is this going to be a bounce? You talk about the optics are great and all of this, but does it really make any difference politically? It seems like he was elected because it was anti-PT, because of crime and all these issues. He became very identified, associated with Trump, but I still don't understand what the political benefits are from that and how. In Latin America, I think Trump has about 15% support overall in the region. So is Brazil the exception? And if so, why?
Mateus, why don't you start us off?
Okay. I don't think the rationale for Bolsonaro in his relationship with Trump is popularity, right? I don't think he's playing the Trump card because he thinks that's going to win him support from the base. I don't think most Brazilians have an opinion on Trump. The majority of the electorate, I don't think, pays any attention to Trump. But Trump is important for Bolsonaro for other reasons, because Trump does matter to the small groups on the right. He does matter to the business community, and he matters enormously to the military. And that's why the Brazilians have been trying to build a visit that has deliverables for each one of the three constituencies at an elite level. This is not a mass popular level. I don't think Bolsonaro's popularity is going to be dented by the photo op with Trump. So there is a disconnect there. In fact, when you look at polls, Brazil is not particularly anti-American. Argentina is Colombia is far more anti-American than Brazil is. So I don't think that's the rationale for him. This is not to do with the base, right? It's not to do with electoral calculations. On the issue
With the evangelicals.
with the evangelicals in Congress, I don't think the regular evangelical on the street is very concerned about Trump or Israel in particular. But for the base in Congress, yes, and that's why the meetings with the Christian groups here in DC are taking up a good chunk of the agenda on the one day the president has free, right? On the issue of divisions within the administration, I would say this. Again, these guys do not expect to win. And when the win materialized, they found out that they had to fill all these cabinet positions. And they're still trying to find their footing. And there are lots of disputes within the administration. One such dispute is between the military, who conceive of foreign policy from a sort of geopolitical perspective, who agree that change is needed, who'd been wanting to change the direction of Brazilian foreign policy for a long time, who were very unhappy about foreign policy under the PT, but do not necessarily agree with the foreign minister. You're referring to the foreign minister. The foreign minister has a very clear line. He believes Bolsonaro, alongside Trump and Bibi Netanyahu and the presidents of Poland and Hungary, he believes this is a transnational movement. And he believes the mastermind behind that transnational movement was and remains Steve Bannon. And that's why Bannon is the guest of honor at the embassy the night of the 17th. The military do not agree with that interpretation. And we don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. But the fact is that you have people in the administration who together agree change is needed, that Brazil needs to have a U-turn in foreign relations, but to disagree very strongly on specifics, and we'll step on each other's toes all the time. And the press has been wonderful at, having one interview and then have someone else say the exact opposite, and you don't quite know. I don't think the president has a foreign policy process in place to this date in which he can resolve these tensions. That has not happened yet. Will it happen? We don't know. Could we carry on for 4 years without that ever happening? Of course we can. It's going to be bumpy.
So let me start with your question, Andre, and just try to get at it from a different angle. When I talked about the press earlier and how the press has been behaving with respect to Bolsonaro, it is really interesting to see how differently the press has been behaving with respect to Mourão. So Mourão has given several interviews. The one that Matias mentioned that's in the FT this morning is definitely a must-read. But he's given a number of interviews in Portuguese on the radio for the press. He, completely taking a completely different tack from what Bolsonaro has done. Rather than attacking the press, he has elevated the role of the press, and he has been out there saying that the press is very important for democracy to remain intact and for democracy to remain strong. Yes, that bought him a lot of points with the press in Brazil, but not just that. The way that he's always trying to, whenever some outrageous statement comes out of the Palácio do Planalto, Mourão is always out there trying to sort of recast it. Or if not recast it, then at least, somehow massage it so that it sounds differently. And that's been his role. And he has been, in a way, he has become very popular by playing this role. And given that the paper that one of the outlets, the news outlets that I write for, is very representative, I think, of the establishment conservative voice in Brazil. That says nothing about my own political views, by the way. Okay, it's a diverse paper, but it has a very particular editorial line. That paper in particular has been expressing a lot of support for Mourão. And that is, as I said before, the voice of the establishment, the more conservative establishment. So how these tensions are going to get resolved, obviously the family around Bolsonaro are not very happy that these tensions are there. And how this is actually all going to get resolved isn't clear, because in a way, for credibility, the Bolsonaro administration cannot give up on the generals. It's really very different from what's happened here in the U.S. I mean, you can have these comparisons, oh, the generals are the adults in the room and all that kind of stuff, which is probably true in the Brazilian context. But unlike what we've seen here, Bolsonaro cannot get rid of the generals. So they will be there. And how exactly those dynamics are going to play out, that part isn't clear. But it's fascinating to watch. And it's particularly fascinating to read, you know, the editorials coming out of the Brazilian press in this respect, because it's very revealing. Barbara, on your question about business and BNDES, part of my answer just now kind of touches on that, because the, let's say, big business or the big private sector companies in Brazil, and I think that includes partly the financial sector too, they're still supportive of Bolsonaro, but I think to a large extent because there are people like Mourão in the room. So, you know, from what I said just now about the press and the press being the voice of a certain portion of the business community, I think reveals that very, very, very clearly. For smaller business owners or, you know, just medium-sized business owners, again, you know, the overall sense was, I think, what we were talking about before, the overall sense was there was this complete fatigue with the PT, and therefore, you know, there were a lot of people who ended up supporting Bolsonaro, but these are exactly the portions of the Brazilian economy that have been suffering the most. So these are the ones that need to see results very fast. And if these results are not forthcoming, then, you know, that support is going to go away. BNDES is really interesting. So BNDES is now being headed by Joaquim Levy, who was with the World Bank just before he went back to Brazil. And prior to that, if you'll remember, he was a finance minister for about 10 months or so in the Rousseff administration, trying to turn things around, right? Specifically trying to turn the fiscal situation around. He is, I think, a very good person to have at the top of BNDES. He's probably about the best person I can think of technically that could be heading BNDES at this moment. And he will shrink BNDES. BNDES needs to be shrunk, and it needs to redirect its activities towards, you know, the goals that it needs to define a mandate for itself. And I think this is one of the things that, you know, Joaquim Levy was called to do. Define a mandate for BNDES, focus the bank on those particular activities, and that will involve shrinking just because BNDES has been all over the place for the last few years. I mean, that came down some under Temer, but was still not enough, so he will do that. How's that going to play out with the business community? Unclear. So financial markets actually like this, and they're right to like it, because the size of BNDES and just the things that it does creates a lot of distortions in financial markets in Brazil. And you see it in the spreads, and you see it, I've done a lot of empirical work on this where you can see that very clearly. The business community, so the people who are actually producing and relying on some of these loans, there's already been somewhat of a transition, because the really heavy subsidized lending by BNDES isn't happening anymore. That was changed under Temer. So that part has kind of been taken out of the room, but the shrinkage of the balance sheet and of the asset side may still create some noise, you know, with the business community. But I think at this point now, people largely expect that to happen. So I don't see the changing role of BNDES as being particularly problematic for support for Bolsonaro in any meaningful way. And finally, on your point about Trump, I fully agree with Matthias and the things that he has said. I would just add that, quite frankly, Brazilians aren't that focused on Trump. And I think that, the photo op will be good, but, just as they aren't focused on Trump regarding whatever it is that Trump does, I don't think they're going to be all that focused on, the nice photo ops that Bolsonaro is going to have next week. So I'm a little bit less, can I call you sanguine? I'm a little bit less sanguine than you are on that point. So.
Is there anything that could happen on this trip? Last question, quick, because we're over time, that would make you feel good about the visit? Is there any sort of outcome that you could plausibly think of that would say this was a
Does
real
that mean feel
success?
good about Bolsonaro?
About Brazil and
About
the
Brazil.
future? And
I don't know if I want to answer that question.
Well, you don't have to.
I think
You
it's
don't
going to
want
be, let me put it
Don't
this way.
require it.
I think chances are this is going to be a good meeting for Bolsonaro. I think Bolsonaro is going to go back home thinking he had a win.
Regardless of what happened.
No, I think it's pretty clear what's going to happen. There's going to be a statement on Venezuela. There's going to be several statements of mutual support. If the final communique has any language to the effect that the United States will support Brazil's quest for accession to the OECD, that's going to be a big, big win, although it's unclear that's going to happen. But I think they're pretty sure this is going to be a good visit. Could anything derail the visit? I think the question
Oh, that's a good
is.
question. That's a better
Two things. A picture in the front page of the Washington Post with Bolsonaro and Steve Bannon, I think would be not good, in particular for Democrats, because that could create trouble for Bolsonaro moving forward. And I think if the current investigations pertaining to alleged corruption in the family, if we were to have more of that next week in the US press, or if more revelations linking militias in Rio to the family were to appear in the front page of US papers, I think that could hurt the visit. But overall, I think it's going to be a good visit for Bolsonaro and a good visit for Trump.
He's already said it all. I don't need to say anything
Okay,
else.
well, let's give a cheer. No. 11 o'clock. No. Oh, thank God. No.
Questioning the will.
No, I think we should call it time and thank Mateus and Monica for really terrific discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.